Tabling the first volume of my annual Energy Conservation Progress Report with the Speaker. It's entitled Restoring Balance because it's a review of the first 3 years of the implementation of the Green Energy Act. And I've observed that government policy activity and public discussion have not been balanced with respect to the two equally important thrusts promised in the government's original news release. We all know that the Green Energy Act was about facilitating renewable energy projects, but there's been little attention given to the other objective of fostering a culture of conservation by assisting homeowners, government, schools, and industrial employers to transition to lower energy use. So, in the interests of restoring balance, this report refocuses on the government's progress in cultivating that culture of conservation. I've looked at 4 major energy conservation commitments that the government made in that announcement 3 years ago, and today I'm giving my assessment of how well they've done in meeting those commitments. There is some good news. The government promised to make energy efficiency a central tenet of the Ontario Building Code, and I think they've done the job. The code has been improved substantially with respect to energy efficiency, and we currently await further quite aggressive code improvements which have been proposed and submitted to public comment. There have been some lost opportunities, however, because of the 5-year review cycle presently followed for the code. Fluctuating energy costs, as well as the rapid changes in technology and construction practices, argue strongly for a faster review and implementation cycle. So I've recommended that to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. There's also a promise to green Ontario government and broader public sector buildings. And with some exceptions, they have made considerable progress in this regard. They have had a broader public sector measuring, planning, and reporting on their energy consumption, and there are no targets or provincial benchmarks for energy consumption in public buildings set yet, but as the data is collected, I expect these will be created. This will help operators of all public buildings learn from the actions of the best performers and raise their game to similar levels of efficiency. The monitoring needs to be expanded to include energy consumption in other sectors like transportation fleets. So I have suggested that the public sector be able to voluntarily report to such information and that later it be made mandatory. Now, an anomaly in the Green Energy Act promise, is that while the government requires the broader public sector to publicly report on energy consumption in buildings like hospitals and schools, it has yet to require ministries to publicly report on the energy consumption of the government's own buildings, something I recommend they correct. Another commitment of the Green Energy Act was to raise the minimum standard for energy efficiency of household appliances to the levels of the Energy Star product labeling. Basically, that would mean Ontarians would only be able to buy dishwashers and clothes washers and such that were high efficiency. It was a good idea, and not a great imposition on the consumers because in most cases, Energy Star appliances were being chosen by a majority of purchasers anyway. But the ball was dropped, and it didn't happen. And now instead of leading the pack, Ontario is a follower in appliance energy efficiency standards. But the big disappointment for Ontarians with respect to both saving energy and consumer protection was the failure of the government to meet its commitment to implement mandatory home energy audits prior to the sale of homes. The appropriate language was put in the legislation, but it has never been proclaimed into law. This is important legislation, and I don't understand why they have failed to implement it. We don't buy a refrigerator without knowing how much energy it consumes. We don't buy a new car without knowing its fuel consumption. Young people are already stretching their financial capacity to the limit in order to buy a home. Why do we expose them to unknown risks with respect to energy costs? Regular people don't have the expertise to look at a house and assess its energy efficiency. That's why in jurisdictions in Europe, the United States, and Australia, an example there, have put in place various kinds of mandatory energy use disclosure policies on real estate. By bringing this information into light, we protect consumers and help them place a market value on energy efficiency in the home, which will hopefully drive additional conservation actions. If the government wants to foster a culture of conservation in our society, making people conscious of the energy consumption of our homes is an essential first step. We need mandatory home energy efficiency disclosure in Ontario as promised. Thank you. I'll take your questions.
Commissioner, I understand understand that you had some issues with this budget bill, that it might, that there's some elements of it that you feel might reduce environmental protections in Ontario. I was just wondering if you could.
I do have issues with the budget bill, but I don't comment on bills before the legislature, sorry. I let them make, the government, my task is to make, let the government make their decisions, the legislature make their decisions, and then I'll comment quite candidly, I think, on what those decisions are with respect to their environmental impacts. But right now, we have legislation before the legislature, and there's every opportunity for them to make the best decision. Sure.
Overall, can you give the government a sort of a letter grade on how well they've done on conservation?
Well, you can't, you know, it's I used to be a professor. I don't, as you may have known in this position, haven't been giving grades, but I do give incompletes, or used to give incompletes, and I think that would be the remark that would be on the report on this case, because clearly there's two sectors where there, you know, if we just look at those four major promises, two we have some success, and one was ignored and is now has to struggle to fulfill their promise, to get ahead to look at other appliances, and the other one is clearly outstanding and needs to be addressed.
In terms of the, I'm sorry.
Well?
In terms of the mandatory energy audits for homes, why do you think that's been held up?
I don't know why it's being held up. I don't think it's, I mean, you know, previous to the Green Energy Act, there was a private member's bill along these lines. Mr. McNeely, I believe, introduced it, and there seemed to be all-party support for that. So there seems to be or was at least a broad base of support for this, and so it was no surprise to see it in the Green Energy Act. The surprise was to see them back down and not implement it, and I don't have a reason for that. You'd have to ask the government. I certainly see no valid. We've looked at it very thoroughly, and I see no valid reason. There's no reason to hold back. The legislation is done. Get ahead and implement it, and I think it would be a very good thing for energy efficiency in Ontario.
When are you going to look at the renewable energy projects? Are you taking a look at those? Are you going to review those and that aspect of the bill?
Which we're talking what renewable energy projects. I mean, I reported all along on renewable energy projects, and I will continue to. But I mean, we just had our final Fit 2 released just the other day, and of course that'll be discussed in future reports.
Will you be taking a breakdown look at some of the job creation targets that they promised and
in the future, we'll look at the other half again. But there's been lots of discussion in the last 3 years about renewable energy. This report focuses on that, as I said, that major. It was a two-part thing. We make a commitment on renewable energy, which they've done, and we've all discussed the implications, and we'll continue to. No doubt about that. But let's go back and look at the other half of this, which was major initiatives in energy conservation, and that's the central. That's the cheapest energy we can get. These are really some good thrusts, policy thrusts, and so that's what this report is about. The energy conservation half.
You mentioned that the bold new promise has sort of been replaced by caution and timidity. Is that from a ministerial point of view? Do you think is that the failure here? Is that they've lost sort of a driving force, or?
Well, clearly, I mean, it's been a lot of. It's hard to say when you say ministerial point of view. That sort of points to a minister, and we've had several ministers. So I don't think we would make it an individual person, but I look at it collectively as the government momentum, if you like, the cabinet, the government momentum, and they're the ones that would direct. They made these promises to the people. They put in place the legislation, and they have ceased to deliver. So that failure probably relates to several aspects of the government. I'm sure the Minister of Finance, for instance, had something to say about some of these things as well. So I would let's say it's a collective government failure to deliver.
There was a lot of resistance from the real estate industry on the term mandatory. They wanted voluntary. What would another path be?
Well, we've had some opportunity in the past few years to have voluntary reporting on energy efficiency of homes, and I have information to suggest that since 2008, if you look at all the multiple listing services in the Greater Toronto Area, you'll find about 625 homes that actually had energy efficiency information attached to the listing out of 100,000 listings a year. So clearly the voluntary approach is not successful, and clearly there, other jurisdictions we've seen, and if you look at the other benefits, in Australia where they've done some actual review, have had this program in place and looked at some numbers. They found that, in fact, what this does to housing prices is increase the value of the energy efficient ones. You get a positive premium on your house if you're energy efficient, which of course is a real reward for those people who invest in energy efficiency. There's no other, according to the Australian study, there's no other detrimental side to this. It's all a premium bonus for energy efficient homes.
Do you think it would create jobs as well?
Well, we know it creates jobs, and in fact, I mean, we had both levels of government supporting energy home renovation programs up till of March of last year, and we've seen the numbers. There was a tremendous amount of activity, and really quite, in fact, we were virtually oversubscribed. It was when they were cut off. I think both governments were a little nervous about the amount of money they were spending because of the great enthusiasm for the public to do the basic energy efficiency on their homes. So we know it creates, and it creates local jobs, of course, in Ontario. We're not talking about bringing technology from around the world. We're talking about installing Ontario-made installation by contractors in the towns and cities of Ontario. So it's the best kind of jobs in times of economic downturn.
You said probably the Minister of Finance had some input into these.
Well, in the sense of the cost.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if you can comment on that. First, I mean, are these programs costly to the government, and are they costly to the economy, or is there?
Well, I would argue, I mean, we've got different programs. I mean, clearly the costs involved, there's costs involved in bringing government buildings up to snuff. That's one of the promises, and there's no question. That's an investment you make, but I would argue the payback is there in the longer term, but nonetheless, it is a short-term capital investment required, so that's one. The mandatory home audits is not a cost to the government so much, but the building code, they would see that as that would really be a cost to the building industry. But again, I would argue that where the changes have been made, they've been embraced by the builders and long-term beneficial effects on the cost of operation in buildings for the society. So I guess it's a matter of balancing your short-term cash with the value of long-term investments.
Is there any rough idea of some of the financial savings that could be had accumulatively for all of these costs?
Well, I mean, sure, there's some specific numbers in the report. For instance, when they backed down on the light bulbs, remember the Ontario in 2007 went ahead and said they were going to bring in more efficient mandatory light bulbs by January 1st, 2012, which didn't happen because as things progressed, we were ahead of the states, we were ahead of the government of Canada, and then we reneged, fell back and delayed it 2 years. And at least the Canadian government, of course, went back to 2014 as well. And the estimates are $300 million of energy that will be consumed by Canadians in lighting that wouldn't have to happen just by backing off by 2 years. So there are some savings. There's anecdotal savings in a number of sectors like that. I think there's some savings going forward in the building code changes, for instance, that finally came into place in January 1st, 2012. A house built this year in Ontario will be 20% more energy efficient than a house built last year. Well, that's quite a remarkable saving. Now, did we have to wait to 2012? Well, we didn't. The City of Toronto didn't wait to 2012 to implement standards for our glass condos in Toronto. They used the Planning Act techniques to get a green building standard put in place in 2010. And I don't know, I haven't seen any numbers that actually how much saved, but we know going forward that condos built since 2010 in Toronto are way more efficient, energy efficient than condos built elsewhere in the similar structure in Ontario. And that 2-year gain in Toronto will save us money every year into the future for the entire life of those buildings.
Is conservation as important as bringing clean energy online, or?
Conservation is more important, and that's a sort of a constant message you'll hear out of my operation. First of all, what is at the margin, what is the cheapest form of energy to us to expand our energy flow? And there was no debate. You go to any of the agencies in Ontario or elsewhere, conservation is the cheapest form of new energy at the margin. And we have the technology to make substantial savings. We've actually done quite a bit, but we have huge opportunities going forward. And that's why the emphasis in this report is to get the focus back on conservation. We're so distracted by renewable energy and there are lots of issues about renewable energy to distract us, granted. But the opportunity for our society in terms of save money and to be efficient is in conservation, especially with the incredible improvements in technology that have been made in recent years.
One thing, and sorry, I mean, I haven't had a chance to read the whole report, but you talk near the end of it, just scanning through, about the lack of the IPSP, the Integrated Power System Plan.
Yeah.
And it's sort of unannounced death. Should that be replaced? I mean, what would you?
Well, I'm
like
sort
to
of,
see?
in the back of the report, I sort of touch on some of the things I've been following for some years, and we have a system where we have these. We're supposed to run our energy system on an IPSP, but we haven't had one for years, and we have a long-term energy plan which was supposed to roll into an IPSP, but it hasn't happened. So I basically am at. I mean, I'll accept the existing system. They better get on with it. Or, and really I'm raising the question there, is the day of that methodology of the IPSP passed, and are we going to, is the way forward for the government to have a long-term energy plan and issue directives out of the Ministry of Energy? It appears that's what they're doing. So if that, and I'm all right with that, in the sense that that's a workable model, but you sort of have to get it clear what we're doing, Are we going to the Ontario Energy Board with an IPSP, or are we not? I think if we have decided in Ontario to change the technique, let's announce that. But right now, we're sort of in this uncertain area where we're still expecting there to be an IPSP, but it never seems to get to the OEB, or at least never seems to get resolved.
What do you feel the benefits to Ontario homeowners, buyers and sellers are
Oh.
from implementation?
Tremendous. I mean, so many people, myself included, have invested in, trying to improve the energy efficiency of older homes. Because, as you know, go back, a large portion of our building stock were built well before there were energy efficiency standards that we have anything like today. So, and all those people, are basically, we don't give them any reward, or the market doesn't overtly reward them. I guess in some cases, if there's something very spectacular, the market rewards them. But the difference between an old home built in the 70s on a given street, where the one party does nothing but cosmetic work and has an energy efficient home, and the person next door invests in high efficiency windows and high insulation and a high efficiency gas furnace and that kind of thing, you don't see the market return on that. So that's a barrier. That's a disincentive. It doesn't stop a lot of people. I'll acknowledge a lot of people do it for the savings, for their own interests. But if you're a business, you look at your home like in a business person's perspective, especially if you're later in life, when you have the money to do these things, you say, I'm only going to have the house 5 years before I retire. Why should I invest $20,000 in energy efficiency? Well, the answer is, if you have a home energy mandatory home audit, when the audit will show the house is worth $20,000 more. And so it's worth doing. It'll make it more saleable, and it's worth doing. And the buyer gets the rewards of that and sees the merits of that. If you don't have it, if you're working in a void of information, and one house is, the house next door is up to sell for the same price, and you say, why did I spend all that money? So I think it's very good for the market.